CEO of Inversant, and I'd like to welcome you again to another one of our Inversant Insight discussions. Today, for the first time, we have an outstanding sponsor in Acadian Asset Management. Acadian is an outstanding organization based in Boston. They've been very much involved with our work at Inversant over the last several years, and we greatly appreciate them sponsoring this wonderful discussion that we're going to have today with two outstanding guests. Let me say to those who are listening, whether you're a higher education administrator or whether you're working in a nonprofit organization, or if you're in philanthropy trying to get a deeper understanding about some of the issues and concerns that institutions and students and families are facing with regards to student debt and college financing, we really appreciate your joining us in these Inversant conversations, our insight conversations, and we hope that you get helpful information that will help guide your work to better meet the needs of students and allow more young people to head off into higher education. So let me just say a few words about our guest today. I've had a chance to talk with both of them previously, and I'm impressed. So I'm going to just read off of their bios because these are heavyweight players, and I'm glad that they're sharing some time with us. Let's begin with Jaime Ramirez-Mendoza. He's a policy analyst at the Education Trust. Let me just say that the Education Trust is a fierce advocate for educational opportunity, access, and success in Washington, D.C. Everyone in Washington knows Education Trust, and the people that they bring on board are some of the best in the country. Jaime works with partners and experts to advance equitable policies around college affordability and student success at the federal, state, and institutional level. Prior to joining the Ed Trust, Jaime worked at Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion as a diversity, equity, and inclusion intern at the Harvard Graduate School of Education, where he did his graduate work. Prior to coming to Harvard, he worked with Destination College Advising Corps at UCal Berkeley, where he worked with talented young people, helping and guiding them along to higher educational opportunities and possibilities. All of this rooted in his own personal life experience himself, growing up and trying to get his own education, seeing how difficult it was for many of his peers to do the same. And this motivated and inspired him to do the work that he's doing. And we greatly appreciate your work, Jaime, and we are in awe of the Ed Trust as an advocacy group in Washington at the highest levels of government. Let me also now turn to our other guest, Jillian Berman. She's an award-winning reporter at MarketWatch, where she specializes in student debt and the economics of education. She's one of the few reporters fully dedicated to covering this nation's $1.3 trillion student loan debt issue. Her work illuminates how student debt burdens a wide swath of Americans and how these loans affect individuals and macro economies. She's chronicled these issues many times over the last several years. She's widely read, greatly respected, previously worked at the HuffPost, is chronicled in USA Today, the Wall Street Journal, and Bloomberg News. All look to her for her insights and perspectives on these important issues. So I'm so happy to have the two of you with us today. And I would say that there's two overarching issues that we're going to look at, we're going to unpack today. One being how has the way we finance higher education exacerbated the racial wealth gap? One thing, how the way we finance it, and how do students' debt and the racial wealth gap go hand in hand? So student debt, racial wealth gap tied together with this whole question of how we finance higher education. So Jaime, since you come at this from a very personal level, I'm going to ask the first question to you, which is at Ed Trust, how is your work guiding you into these issues, and what right now is the foremost thing on your agenda relative to your work at the Education Trust?
Yeah, thank you. Muchísimas gracias, Charlie, for that introduction. For those who don't know, the Education Trust is a policy and advocacy organization in DC, and we really use racial justice and equity as our lenses to provide access and opportunity and affordability for college for low-income students and Black and Latinx students in particular. And I specifically work on college affordability. That's my portfolio. And more specifically, the student debt crisis that is impacting many students, in particular Black students. So right now, we're currently trying to figure out how to transform the financial aid system to be more equitable and not be giving students essentially just the loans as the only option to fund their higher education dreams. And that can come in many forms. We're looking at things such as, expanding the Pell Grant, to make it more, to cover more of the costs, expanding it to undocumented students and justice impacted students, communities that are disproportionately impacted by Black and brown folks, in addition to creating equitable free college programs. So those are some of the things that the Education Trust is focusing on in regards to affordability for college.
With regards to your thoughts about conversations that you're having at the collegiate level with college and academic leaders in the country, are you getting a lot of support from the higher education community as equal partners working alongside with you on trying to address these issues? And in particular, with regards to your efforts and conversations at the legislative level?
To be honest, a lot of it has been more at the legislative level than institutional.
Yep.
And really trying to provide an equity lens to these different policies. So I'll give you an example. I mentioned free college.
Yep.
College sounds great as a slogan, but oftentimes free college, the way it's structured can really impact who it benefits and how it benefits them. So a lot of the times these programs are structured to where they take into Pell Grants into account first and state grants into account first before they even account for the free college grant. So oftentimes low-income students who do qualify for need-based aid, such as Pell Grants, don't benefit from free college programs.
Right.
So that's kind of more of the conversation that we have, where we look at these different policies that are in place and we provide an equity lens and provide recommendations for them to be improved.
Yeah, I mean, that's a very important insight, because I think some folks will think at a very superficial level that, free college is going to solve everything and it's all going to just be solved. But if you really get under the hood and start looking more carefully at this, you see that there are other dimensions of this, which turns me to Jillian. You write extensively about these issues and have a particular lens on how this affects low-income families, low-income students, and in particular with regards to wealth and income issues that impair their ability to fully participate in life in the high quality opportunities that they might have if they weren't burdened with excessive debt. Could you say a little bit about what your own research has led you to understand and what kind of the issues are as you're framing in your writing?
Sure, and thanks for having me. I think, there's a few things going on. One, and I think this is a big trend, that we've understood for a while and that we're beginning to understand even more, and that, kind of the free college conversation that Jaime mentioned plays into, is the way that government, and in particular states, have changed their level of investment over the past, several decades in higher education. And I think, a lot of people know, right, that it's gone down, and in particular, since the Great Recession, and those funding levels have struggled to recover. But I think, one thing that is often missing from that conversation, right, is this decline in funding has happened at the same time as sort of the diversity of who attends higher education has grown. So the government, a long time ago, when colleges were, largely the purview of more men and more white men, the government, was investing in it. That investment has declined at a time when colleges are more likely to, to have low-income students, to have students whose parents didn't go to college, to have Black students, Latinx students, women, and so what does that mean? That means now, at a time when the college-going population is more diverse, they're being asked to shoulder more of the cost, and so obviously that has implications for for their ability to sort of move on in their financial life after they graduate.
As a follow-up to that, I mean, with Market Watch, you're obviously communicating with some of the most significant, important entities in America, since they are massive drivers of our economy, and keeping a close watch on how we manage growth and compete in the global marketplace. It would seem as though that a failure to get more low-income and minority students, given the change in demography in America right now, through college with the credentials that they need to be able to enter into the marketplace and go to work at many of these companies and firms would be critical and important. Yet, I'm not sure that we're seeing the kinds of pushes that we need to see from the private sector about the seriousness of the issue in ways that the business sector, the corporate sector can play a role in advancing these agendas. And based on your work, as you're talking with people and writing about this, are you picking up any changes in thought, or what kinds of things surface in your mind with regards to that?
Yeah, so I would say that probably the, kind of the main way that the private sector has approached this issue, or rather, I guess, big private sector employers have approached this issue is by offering some kind of student loan pay down as like part of their benefits package. And obviously, while that is, that's great, and it's of course better than nothing, it, in terms of its ability to make a big impact on the issue, it's kind of questionable. For one, the amounts are usually relatively small, and the other thing, right, is that right now the tax treatment on that it's not the same as a contribution to your 401k or something like that. So it's a little bit tricky. The other thing too, though, of course, is that by the time you have a job at one of these companies that's offering it, sort of a famous one that announced they were offering it recently is Google. You have likely sort of, received advantages that, have built on themselves throughout that, have helped you get to an employer like that. So in terms of, helping the people who, who may be struggling the most with their student debt, that kind of thing, it's not gonna, it's not gonna hit that, at the level that we're talking about. So that's kind of the biggest thing that that I've seen private employers discuss with regards to this issue.
Interesting. Jaime, let me turn back to you again, because in one of my earlier conversations, I was talking with two younger people, one who has just recently graduated from college and another one still in college, both minority students. But both of them were concerned about whether or not these conditions that we're seeing around student debt, the cost of higher education, were impediments for young people of color to think that college was still a viable option for them. Was it something that we're agonizing over what and how we advise our young people about the higher educational option and opportunity, primarily because so many young people are carrying the debt that we're talking about now, over 1.3 trillion. And is it advisable for a student to be $50,000 or $60,000 worth in debt with a baccalaureate degree and struggling to find a job, as Jillian was just saying? So based again on your work at the Trust, and more importantly, having come through this yourself, I mean, you've had UCal Davis, Harvard University, you are just an amazing achiever, but I'm sure that you see a lot of your friends who may not have been as fortunate as you've been. So what's your thoughts about how difficult this problem is in disincentivizing young people to think that college really is an option that's going to pay off for them?
Yeah, I mean, like you mentioned, I experienced that myself in high school. I'm a proud son of immigrants. I'm the first person in my family to graduate high school, the first person to get into college. I come from a low-income background. I'm bilingual, and I worked my butt off to really become a competitive applicant. And it wasn't until my senior year when I was applying that I realized that although I was a competitive applicant, I was still in danger of not being able to enroll in a four-year institution because it costs more to go to a public four-year institution in California than what my parents made combined. And my parents the immigrants from Jalisco, Mexico, shout out to them.
I'm sure they watch it.
But we didn't have the wealth, we didn't have the savings to really finance that education. And I was lucky enough to be able to have advocates and be involved in programs such as Avid and Upward Bound to really fill in those gaps and get some scholarships to get a full ride. But the thing is that those are individual solutions to a much bigger systemic problem. And although, yes, students should be going to college, specifically public 2 and 4 year institutions, because they have a probability of entering the middle class through the earnings boost of a college degree, unfortunately, college degree doesn't get rid of the impacts of racism. So I kind of want to shift the conversation and the framing of, is this a student's problem to solve, or is it a systemic problem that we need to eradicate and provide an equity lens to actually make college affordable for all students, and specifically for low income and Black and Latinx students?
Yeah, well, that's the challenge. I mean, I think that's where, the two of you couldn't have been better two people to talk about this, because you both have amazing platforms with which to make the case around this equity and opportunity equation. So one of the concerns, I shouldn't say concerns, but one of the lenses that we've looked at with regards to Jillian's point earlier about the shifting focus of how college has been financed. It had historically been high college aid and small college loans, but that's flipped now, where 2/3 are coming in loans and 1/3 is coming in college age, and that's a massive disincentive and a great financial burden that contributes to this debt crisis that we've been talking about, but also frustrates ability of grads to get out and buy a house, get a car, get married. Jillian, you've written about how this situation has impacted negatively on families and in personal economies. So to one extent, people have said higher education is a individual benefit. So therefore, it should be something that I bear myself, the individual should bear it. Another conversation says that it's a societal good, that the society should play a greater role in ensuring that people get into and through higher education and get into the workforce and contribute to our macroeconomic growth and prosperity. So do you feel, Jaime, from a political point of view on your side, and Jillian from your side, from looking at from the private sector, do you feel that it's clear in people's minds, the broader public, that this dichotomy is at the heart of part of the problem that we're dealing with? Should we be looking at more as a societal benefit and investing more in it? Or should we be turning more towards, this is an individual, what do they sometimes refer to it as, rugged individualism? The strong are going to survive, pull yourself up by your bootstraps. But it seems as though that theory doesn't seem to be producing the kinds of success or outcomes that we've been looking at. So to get back to the general question, the broader societal issue versus the individual private gain issue. In your discussions and writings and thinking, does this equation play into it as you see it?
Jillian, would you like to go first?
Yeah, sure. I can jump in. Yeah, I think you've pointed out definitely what is a very interesting tension when it comes to higher education, that I think I don't want to say it's totally unique, but doesn't exist in a lot of other spaces where I think one can really argue that, the individual certainly gets a benefit from, going to college. But of course, we as a society get a benefit when more people go to college. And actually, I was, for a piece I did a couple of days ago, having a conversation with an economist at Georgetown University who brought up that, sort of historically, again, the way that we've kind of done this is we've invested, we've tried to put our education dollars in sort of what was viewed as kind of like the, sort of, we've invested our education dollars in a very, very small, kind of segment of the talent. And that's not going to work anymore. And, that's not going to work, number one, because, well, mostly if we're thinking about the US as being competitive, in the global economy, you have a lot of other countries that are larger and educating a much larger share of their population. So if you just look at that, that's gonna spell a challenge. The other thing too, though, is, when you think about whether it's an individual benefit or whether it's a societal benefit, I think a lot of times when we think about it as an individual benefit, we sort of forget that all the steps that people take to get to college, society has invested, depending on who they are and how much money they make and what race they are and all of that, society has invested in them, sort of at different levels to get to that point. So, the same economist that I was talking to, and he brings this up a lot, but higher education has kind of become like a capstone to a lot of the inequality that we see in the K through 12 school system. And so, what we see is, largely white, wealthier students who've sort of had the benefit of, very well-resourced public K through 12 public schools, or private schools maybe. They're more likely to be able to get to the types of colleges that are also very well resourced and, can offer generous financial aid to the low-income students that come, though there are sort of fewer of them there than at other schools. But B, have the kinds of resources that get students to and through school, and once they graduate, put them in a good position to get a job. So I think, it's kind of, there's a lot baked in there, right? In terms of, how an individual benefits versus how a society benefits, and also what that means in terms of how we invest in this.
I may.
And to add to that, I think it's both, in the sense that we advertise it as an individual good and it has societal benefits, but we leave it up to the individual, unfortunately, for them to fund these college education. And what I mean by societal benefits is I know there was a recent report by the city that showed America could have been $16 trillion richer if it wasn't for the inequities in education and housing and wages between Black folks and white folks. That's $16 trillion. Right. That's not chump change. And in addition, I think you also mentioned, lifting yourself up by the bootstraps, and this merit myth. If you don't provide a social justice lens to student debt, you miss out of the systemic issues. And, social justice means different things to different people. So for me, social justice means accounting for things such as identity, opportunities, privilege, wealth, and systemic racism within systems, and how that impacts folks and how to equitably transform them to better serve everyone, especially those that are most marginalized. So when you look at student debt, just at 1.7 trillion overall, they're like, wow, this is a big crisis. But when you apply the social justice lens to it and you look at identity, you look at wealth, and you look at racism, it becomes evident that the student debt is impacting Black and brown students the hardest.
Yeah, I think that we certainly, there's an avalanche of data that supports the point that you just made, that Black, brown students are indirectly harmed by the way the system is presently working. And I think that looking at it through the racial lens it's hard for us as a nation to come to terms with the fact that this history that we're carrying with us still continues to contribute to the kinds of issues and concerns that we're talking about today. But yet, unless we talk about these things, it doesn't seem to me that there's going to be a possibility that we can get beyond them and actually unite in the nation to advance, all citizens, so that we have, and can do what this country is capable of doing with a highly educated workforce. You probably know that I was the past chair of the Board of Higher Education here in Massachusetts. And for 2 years, we did nothing else but talk about this issue: lost economic productivity, lost talent, lost ability for us to become global, not only global competitors, but global leaders in not only producing wealth, but producing the kinds of societal changes that we think that all over the world people are struggling with at this time. So I do think that here in the United States, we're uniquely positioned, one, to have the historical background to be able to talk about these issues, but then secondarily to try to actually take some steps to deal with that. So that leads me to the next question that I'll start with Jaime again, because he's up on the Hill all the time talking with people who have immense power in Washington, D.C. Do you see any movement in Washington to a greater understanding of the kinds of the implications of the inequality that we're seeing right now and the damage that this debt is actually having on families, communities, and households? What's your hope factor on that? On a 1 to 10 level, do you think we're at about 6, or are we at 8, or are we at 3?
Like a lot of things right now, everything's kind of fuzzy and up in the air. But what I will say is that in the past, things like student debt or even student debt cancellation was seen as outlandish. It was seen as impossible.
Yeah.
And within the last couple of months, we have seen multiple bills come to the floor, ranging from some sort of student debt cancellation between 10,000 to 50,000.
Right.
And that can have big impacts on students who are being crushed by debt, in particular Black and Brown students. So I think there is hope because these conversations in the past were just conversations, and now they're slowly transforming into some type of policy and being codified into law.
That's great. So Jillian, Jaime just mentioned the piece about the city recent report that came out. I read that myself, and I was actually very impressed with it. We felt that it really is going to change some people's minds that, there's real economic incentives, not only social justice incentives, but there are economic incentives as a nation as to why we need to settle down and start addressing these issues seriously. Do you think that particular report, and I've also heard that there's been some very wonderful statements that have been coming out of the CEO of Bank of America. What kinds of indicators are you seeing in your travels that lead you to believe that we might be starting to get some traction on resolution instead of just talking about the storm that's coming?
Yeah, good question. I think, I will be honest, I think a lot of what I hear is talking about, more talking about the storm. But like Jaime said, I think that there's a lot more, sort of political will around more, kind of drastic approaches to dealing with student debt than in the past. A lot of sort of, even over the past, maybe 10 years, we've gone from kind of much more like incremental sort of tweaks being proposed to, these much broader proposals. I think, in terms of what you see from businesses and kind of the private sector, I think that there's definitely a recognition that this is a problem and that it's a problem that could have, broad economic impacts. I haven't, seen as much on the sort of what will we do about it, but I think it's the fact that it, that it's resonating is definitely, something hopefully that will engender some movement on the issue.
So I'm glad to hear that. I think I think this is one of those, I think you used the term, all hands on deck situations where it really is going to really require for the private sector, the governmental sector, the nonprofit sector, the philanthropic sector to start talking together about a strategy that we think can move the needle on change. But in the meantime, we still have massive amounts of debt. And I'm not sure if we've come up with any concrete strategies that are going to look at about the students who are carrying debt, while at the same time we're working on a strategy to try to not bring another generation of students into massive amounts of debt. So we've got two parallel weights that we're carrying, and it really, when you're carrying that much pressure behind you, it's hard to formulate clear strategies going into fighting a war on two fronts. I'm a military person, so it's hard fighting a war on two fronts. Let me ask the question again about what can higher education do right now, Jaime? If you're a president of a college or a university, in light of the issues that you're advocating for and fighting for on the Hill, is there ways that academic leaders can join more directly with your efforts to help make the case stronger and clearer and the impacts of it understood better than they presently are? Because while I have great friends in Washington and I know they're concerned deeply about these issues, we're still not moving fast enough to do the kinds of things that need to get done. So it seems as though to me, is there a new kind of coalition taking shape, or is a new kind of coalition necessary and needed at this time?
In regards to a coalition, I wouldn't be able to say, but in regards to like state and institutional decision-making that can help students, most definitely. I know California recently just passed a law, the Student Bill of Rights, which actually protects students. It gives more protections in regards to loans that they take out. In addition to, when you think about, I think about the financial aid system right now is currently unaffordable for all students. And then I also think about the students who unfortunately don't even have access to this unaffordable system. And the people that come to mind are previously incarcerated students or currently incarcerated students who don't have access to certain federal or state aid because of their conviction. I think of undocumented students who don't have access to any federal aid at all, and their in-state tuition and in-state aid varies by state. And again, both of these communities are disproportionately Black and brown. So I think of those students who, again, it's exacerbating the racial income and wealth gap because they don't even have the opportunity to potentially go to college, to potentially get that degree, to potentially enter the middle class and kind of reverse some of that. So at the state level, definitely folks providing access to these different communities. And Jillian mentioned this earlier, the shift of merit to need-based aid is very troubling. I know a New America study recently found that over the course of 10 years, there's billions of dollars being given to students who did not financially need it. And for students, specifically white affluent households, they can withstand that financial shock. They can pay the sticker price. For students like myself, who are first gen, who are Latinx, or even Black students, it's not the same. They don't have the same assets or resources to fund college, and that's why they turn to votes to begin with. So reversing that trend and putting more into need-based aid would be critical in providing more equitable access and affordability for students.
Jillian, do you have any thoughts about that particular issue?
About solutions?
Yes.
Or that colleges, I think, Jaime pointed to a big trend that we've seen over the past several years, right, where there's been a shift in sort of using merit aid to lure certain demographics of students, and that often does not align with equity goals. I think too, another thing that people have talked about a lot, sort of like in the ether, but I don't know if I've seen like specific proposals for it, is, when you think about a big complaint, right, when colleges raise tuition, we saw this, for example, during the pandemic, is people always go, why, you have such a big endowment, why aren't you, spending some of that on financial aid? And Ed Trust has actually done some good work on this too. And, I think the colleges will always come back to you and they'll say, well, an endowment isn't, you can't just spend them on whatever you want. The funds are sort of, the donor tells you what they want to fund. But one thing that you can do is you can start shifting your asks for funding to be either more general or we can use it on whatever we want, kind of, or more specific to financial aid. This is something that we really care about, that that we think is really important, and I think that can sort of shift, that may shift the conversation. I mean, another thing with philanthropy too, right, is we know that, and when it comes to colleges, kind of the colleges with the most money keep getting the most money. So if there are philanthropists out there, something to think about are colleges that educate large swaths of students, community colleges, less selective four-year school, public four-year schools, things like that, but who, HBCUs, who, in the headlines, a lot of times you don't see the, $600 million donation or whatever went to them, right? So thinking a little bit creatively about how to use your philanthropy, or if you have those philanthropic dollars, differently.
Yeah, I think that's an absolutely excellent point, because I do think that there are a lot of folks in philanthropy who don't know the nuances of the discussion that we're having right now, which is part of the reason why we have these conversations, is that what we're trying to do is to get and engage more people in a deeper discussion of the subtleties of how this all plays out. So, for example, we've talked a lot about, income and equity, but we haven't really talked a lot about wealth. But wealth is one of the functions that we go to college, we want to accumulate wealth, because wealth is an intergenerational factor that can make the next generation. Jaime, in your case, your parents may not be able to do for you what you're going to be able to do for your children, hopefully, because you are going to have higher possibilities to earn income and to accumulate wealth, which then allows you to have the financing necessary to keep your children from having to borrow excessively to go on to higher ed. So I do think that for folks who are listening in the philanthropic community, the point that you raised, Jillian, is extremely important. I think you need to think about how we're supporting our colleges and institutions. And if you want to look at your college or institution through the social justice lens, that may be one of the ways that you can be helpful to promote access and opportunity and reduce debt, which then allows for the accumulation of wealth, which then allows for addressing income inequality in America, which is a very big problem. And I think most people are concerned about that when they see poverty, what the outcomes of poverty are. No one, I believe, in America wants or supports what these tragic outcomes that we see for people who live in poverty. But yet we are struggling with solutions to try to address that. And so on the Hill, Jaime, you and your team from Ed Trust are, as I said, fierce advocates and fighters for the kinds of support that we need and the kinds of federal attention that we need to deal with this. And I would also say that the folks in the corporate sector, who I think really haven't weighed in as heavily as they need to. So I'm gonna put in my Charlie Desmond personal plug here, and that's why I so much appreciate the work that you're doing, Jillian, because I think you are shining a light on this in a thoughtful, analytical type of a way. And I don't think that we would see as many leaders stepping forward as we are now, with who wouldn't, if they didn't have a little bit of shelter, that there's a body of knowledge and people out there that are suggesting that these things are the right thing for us to be doing. So I want to come back to solutions, because a lot of what we see today is a reiteration and a complete, total absorption in talking about the problems that we're facing and not yet working on possible solutions. I'm an advocate for building broader coalitions, and I'm going to ask the question that I asked a minute ago. If you're building coalitions, Jillian, who do you think we need to bring to the table that's not at the table right now to get a resolution of this student debt issue?
That's a good question. People that are not at the table. I think, right, like you mentioned, we haven't seen a ton from the private sector, sort of on this issue. I think too, and it's hard to get a representative, sort of like a representative of this on some kind of coalition, but students and families. I think that's they know it's happening, they feel it, but I don't know that people necessarily talk to them about what would you like us to do about this. And I think we saw that in the sort of, in the kind of the whole lead up to reopening college campuses this year, that was not so much an affordability issue, but, we kind of saw a lot of, colleges saying we did this because this is what students and families want, and then students and families saying that was not what I wanted, or the committees that they used to decide what they were going to do, like there wasn't a necessarily a student representative in a lot of cases. So I think that that perspective is really important, and I think that perspective might lend itself to to coming up with solutions that are sort of simple and, and a little bit easier to understand. I think a lot of the times when we talk about like, what are we going to do? it kind of, a lot of the solutions can mirror a lot of the complexity that's already baked into the system. And so, finding a way to, to mitigate it in a way that students and families, sort of can react to, would be a good thing.
Good point. Jaime, what are your thoughts? Where do you think we need to be heading? Who's not at the table? I mean, generally, when I did my work in Washington, I used to think that these are the masters of the universe, that they have so much power. But when you actually talk to legislators, they generally want to say that it's much more complicated and again much more nuanced than you might think. And getting good things done is not as easy as it looks. It takes an awful lot of work to make that happen. So from your perspective, what kinds of things can we do if our audience that's listening to us today says, what can we do to help the Education Trust in its efforts to bring these discussions to other ears in Washington? What kinds of things do you suggest that we do? Sorry for the phone that's ringing in the background. Someone will pick it up. Go ahead.
Well, Jillian literally hit the nail on the head in regards to having student voice and familial voice. And Ed Trust is actually currently right now hosting a National Black Student Debt Project where we're actually interviewing Black borrowers to get their experience, to center their voices, to see their borrowing habits, how that's impacted their lives, what opportunities they've had, what opportunities have been robbed of them. And the idea of at the end of this study is to craft policy solutions that center the experiences of those who are directly impacted. So that's one. Another thing that I think about is oftentimes folks are at the table, but they're not listened to. And I often think about like community colleges who are severely underfunded. And I highlight community colleges specifically because we haven't even mentioned for-profits and how that disproportionately impacts Black and Latinx students. And how for-profit studies time and time again have shown that they struggle with graduating students, they struggle with preparing students. Oftentimes students actually end up making less than what they would for those who have a high school degree. And this has racial impacts because over half of those enrolled at for-profits are Black and Latinx students. And for me, I think about my siblings and I'm like, probably the same certificate or degree you could have gotten at a for-profit, you could have had at the local community college. Yeah. So how can we reinvest in our higher education system, specifically, open access institutions, public institutions, for them to actually reach out and equitably provide the aid for these students to believe that they can afford college? So those are the two things that come to mind.
Yeah, I think that particularly the point that you raised about the community colleges, they are the gateway institutions for many people of color in the nation, sometimes primarily because they're lower cost to attend, but even though the costs are escalating somewhat. But as you say, it may not necessarily be the pathway to a four-year institution or to a degree or to a higher paying job, which, going back to the conversation I had with students previously in one of my sessions, it was the observation that, well, I have friends who didn't go to community college. They work in the trades. They have a car. They put a down payment on a home. I'm still, trying to graduate from a four-year degree. So, I mean, I think those kinds of discussions and dynamics and engaging the families that this impacts is critical, so that this good information that you're sharing and broadening the base of the conversation, I think, is so vital and important to the discussion that we have to deal with. And I think the tiered system, that is the community college, Massachusetts kind of looked at California when we put the Massachusetts system, community college, state universities, the university system. And at each one of those levels of the system, there are different dynamics that play into this situation that we're talking with. The higher you go in the system, the lower the minority student participation, the larger the complications of getting into those institutions. And I don't mean that higher, that somehow or another, that means that they're doing more important work for the students that they're serving. I think community colleges are vital and critical to education of vast thousands of people in the nation. But as you said in one of your opening remarks, they are grossly underfunded and they don't have the resources that they need given the population that they're serving. So this brings us back again to, the big aggregate question, which we tried to deconstruct here in this conversation. That is, we've got racial inequality, we've got economic inequality, and we have historically, and I certainly say that I believe that education is the vehicle through which, the greatest and most powerful vehicle through which we could perhaps address these concerns, yet we're struggling in the education sector to maximize our capabilities and our ability to do it. So some of what has to be done, Jillian, you're doing on the private side, which is to put more information and more clarity and more attention on these disparities. And Jaime, you at the federal side, in the governmental side, are talking with legislators and other leaders in Washington, D.C. about things that they need to do. But yet we're still in the middle of a tough battle. And I'm wondering, as we appeal to our audience right now, what do you need to say to the folks who are listening, Jaime, about how they can help the Ed Trust and its efforts in Washington? Are there things that we're not doing that we need to be doing to be more engaged with you personally or with the organization as a whole? And what thoughts come to mind that might be helpful in your perspective?
Yeah, you mentioned budget, and something that always blows my mind is like budgets show like priorities. And usually when folks want to fund something, they find a way to fund it. Their studies have shown that over time, what states have been putting into things like prisons, things like policing has like exponentially increased while funding for higher education has remained flat. So looking at right now, I know we're going to go into a COVID recession. Things are pretty grim, but looking at what we're putting our money into right now and reprioritizing that to something such as education, which actually reduces the probability of students to be reincarcerated, for example, and actually provides better benefits to society as a whole. Again, I know I mentioned this previously, but really talking to your representatives, putting pressure on not just reform, but transformation of our financial aid system, of our higher education system. I mentioned free college in the past, and in 2018, Ed Trust did a report that analyzed 15 statewide free college programs to see what they covered and who was eligible. And later this month, we'll be releasing an update of that report. And while colleges still have a ways to go in regards to centering equity and actually serving low-income students and Black and Latinx students, there's actually an increase in statewide programs. So it shows that states have a growing interest in what makes college affordable. But it's necessary for states to really listen to students and be like, hey, are adult returning students included? Are some college no degree students included who have the debt but didn't get the economic boost that they would have with the degree? I mentioned it previously, are previously and currently incarcerated students or documented students included, who oftentimes are completely marginalized from this conversation entirely. So pushing your representatives for equitable and transformational change within the system would be a start.
I think that's a brilliantly stated comment. I greatly appreciate that. And I think coupled with that is many of the things that are leading to incarceration and to the kinds of, again, outcomes that come from poverty can be addressed if we are able to do a better job of making this education system work for more members of our society, our fellow Americans who come from all the colors of the rainbow. Jillian, many people have talked to me with deep concern because they don't think the private sector, the corporate America, is as engaged as they need to be with the challenge that we're presently facing as a nation. And that's not a criticism of corporate America. It's just that their attention is focused on a lot of things that keep their businesses viable, allow them to be competitive, have the finance necessary to grow, and to be more of a player on the international economic front. But at the same time, we're seeing these challenges that in the nation, where if we had more of this involvement and support, we might be able to get a little more traction on the issues that you write about. So what is it that we can do, our listening audience can do to what is it that in our vocabulary or our narrative that you think would be most helpful for us in communicating our need for the involvement their corporate voices in the kinds of issues that we're discussing today?
Yeah, I think one thing that's, sort of an obvious question, right, or an obvious connection, excuse me, is, talent. Companies, big companies are always looking for the best talent. And if they're, first of all, if the best talent can't afford to go to college, or is going to struggle immensely financially to go to college, that's going to be a problem. They're not going to be available for these employers. So I think, that's something definitely to communicate. And a lot of times, right, these companies, we've seen they're not, the places that they look for talent are not, are not always the wide, they're not casting the widest net. They're sort of looking at the places they've always looked, which have a lot of, tend to be whiter, tend to be wealthier. And so, not just kind of doing what you can to make the, to mitigate the step problem, but also, thinking about ways that you can expand your talent pool. And part of that is by looking at some institutions that maybe you traditionally have not gone to, and that have a larger pool of Black and Brown students, of low-income students, of first-generation students. That's something that companies can kind of do right now. I think the other thing, with the private sector, we've seen over the past, year and a half, this kind of interest in quote unquote stakeholder capitalism, which is the company. We're not just trying to make the most. Our goal is not just to make them as much money as we can for our shareholders. We also care about, the environment. We care about our communities. We care about our employees. And, there's been a lot of promises sort of on that. And I think, and honestly, student debt, that it hasn't necessarily factored so intensely into that, just because, there's a lot of things that, there's a lot of stakeholders out there. But there have been a lot of promises on that front. And it's hard to hold the companies accountable, to it. And so I think doing what you can, as a consumer, as a member of the community, as, a person, to, an employee of a big company, or, if that promise is something that's important to you and something you believe in, then, find a way to hold them accountable. And I think so far it's been challenging to do that. The tools of measuring kind of that, it's much easier to see how well a company delivers to its shareholders than, how they deliver to these other people. So, kind of holding them accountable to those promises, I think, is something that can help too.
I think that's a very good observation and a very good suggestion. It's certainly something for us to think about, which is, I like that the concept of the stakeholder capitalism, this dual bottom line, which is certainly you want businesses to be rewarding for the people who invest in them, but also the benefits and contributions that they make to broader society are equally important. But unlike return on investment or stock returns, people can see that in their checkbook, in their bank accounts, but there's not always so much of the recognition. And I'm really resonating to this because I think this may be one of the things that might be missing, which is how do we bring attention to and shine the light on the companies and the individuals who support those companies that are making the kinds of contributions and investments and statements that are moving the needle on these discussions. And I think that the work that you're doing, Jillian, in your writing is such an important vehicle to which that can happen. But perhaps there's more that we can do to pay, to recognize some of the folks that you're recognizing and writing as change agents and people who are making a difference. There are some ways that we can focus attention on them and bring greater recognition to the important work that they're doing. I think that's quite relevant. So we have had a fabulous conversation today. I think both of you have been just so illuminating, and obviously you know an awful lot about what it is that you're doing. And I think that your efforts have what brought us together. If you weren't doing what you're doing, we wouldn't be talking with you today. And the people who are in our audience listening to you wouldn't be listening to hear your thoughts and your observations and your insights. We call this program Inversant Insights because if we had the solutions to this, we would call it Inversant Facts, but we don't have facts. What we have is insights that we hope will educate and inform us and lead us to a deeper understanding of these challenges that we're facing and more powerful strategies for addressing them. Certainly today, we want to thank very much Jaime Ramirez-Mendoza at Education Trust. Jaime, thank you very much for all of your good work, your hard work, and your intelligence. We appreciate your joining us today, and we certainly look forward to having further contact with you in the future. I'll ask if you have a concluding thought that you'd like to share with our audience before we sign off today.
Yes, a lot of this stuff is really grim. And I want to point out the fact that this isn't the fault of students and their families. We message to students that college is the way out. We message to students that college is a ticket to the middle class. And yet we don't equitably fund college for students, specifically low-income students and Black and Latinx students to actually afford it. I mentioned previously, right now is a very turbulent time. COVID has really brought to light a lot of systemic inequities. You see it within the murders of Black folks, you see it within police brutality, and that racism also stems to higher education and student debt. Because of that, it's kind of sparked this, again, outlandish ideas in the past that were impossible. Now they're at the center of the conversation. Student debt cancellation is a possibility now. Free college is not just getting more airwaves, but we at Trust are actually asking, okay, free college for who and for what and for how long? And then lastly, there's been a huge push by many advocates to double the Pell Grant, which has historically not really provided enough aid to actually cover costs of attendance at public institutions. And in addition to that, there's been bipartisan support to expand that to previously incarcerated students. So those are the kind of three things that bring some type of glimmering hope to me as we continue on.
Thank you very much. And, you're a crusader. And you're fighting a good fight. So I certainly commend you for continuing the work that you're doing and for the intelligence that you're bringing to this work. Jillian Berman, award-winning journalist. Let me just say at Market Watch, and let me just say while we're here, extend our thanks to Market Watch for investing in your work and your attention to this. And we will send a note to them to thank them for what you're doing and for the impact that you're having in the field. You are enlightening us all and making us aware and bringing a voice to people who might not always hear people like me or people like Jaime who are speaking all the time about these issues, but they do read your insightful writing and powerful prose. And so thank you very much for that. And thank you very much for joining us today in this conversation. And I'll say again, if there's any concluding remarks that you'd like to make, this is a good time to do it. Okay,
well, thank you so much for having me. I will echo that you should read Market Watch and our coverage of of this issue. But I would say more broadly, reading up, there's other reporters out there covering this, and just kind of reading up on these issues is really important. I think the narrative surrounding student debt and who is a student loan borrower and who is the most impacted by student debt has really changed over the past maybe 10 or so years. We used to think of it as a millennial, maybe often white, who had high levels of debt and was working in a coffee shop, and we've come to realize that research and reporting has, sort of exposed that, of course, those people exist, but, there are people who went to, a for-profit college and are left with debt and a degree that doesn't work in a labor market, or people who, started college and had to stop out and they have very small amounts of debt, but that debt is a huge burden because they, don't have the degree to get a job. So to get a higher paying job. And then of course, over sort of one of the main topics of this conversation, kind of the racial justice components of student debt and, and how it disproportionately impacts, in particular, Black students and families. And so I think, just reading up, yes, on MarketWatch, but also elsewhere on all of these things will help give people a more nuanced understanding of these issues, and if they want to help, the ways that they can do that too.
Thank you very much. I really want to, again, thank both of you for spending this hour and few minutes with us today. We certainly will be keeping in touch with you. Thank you very much for sharing your thoughts. Let me say to our friends at Acadian Asset Management, thank you very much for your support of our conversation today and for your support of Inversant over the years. We've appreciated your help. We've appreciated your guidance and your involvement in our efforts. And this conversation today is a clear indicator. There are some good people out there that are really weighing and they're putting their oars in the water and they are pulling hard, trying to move this boat in the right direction. So to our listening audience, to our friends in philanthropy, to our friends in higher education, to our friends in the nonprofit, non-governmental sector, as Jaime said, this is not exactly the best time to be doing the work that we're doing, but it's a critical time to be doing the work that we're doing. And we encourage you all to continue your great efforts, support the Education Trust, read MarketWatch, and thank you all. And we'll look forward to seeing you at our next conversation. Take care, be well.